"Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain," said the man behind the curtain. "Perhaps you should pay attention, because this is a valid opportunity for us to pull back the curtain in the battle between truth and lies. On the left-hand side we have Dr. Robert Malone, the leader of those who question the medical ethics of what just happened in a global pandemic. And on the right we have Stu Peters, author of Die Suddenly, the new movie, who is a CIA fake." And that's exactly what I called him in yesterday's video, link in the description. And now that we know there's something dodgy about all this setup, let's go and take a look at what they got wrong, how they got it wrong, and why they got it wrong, and if that was deliberate. We'll start with what Robert Malone says about all this. He says, as I reported yesterday, that movie is sins of information warfare, and that just because our opposition is resorting to underhand tactics doesn't mean we can put out absolute trash movies. And he said this is a trash movie. He says it includes segments misleading at best, which falsely imply cause-effect relationship between a sudden death and a vaccine administration. He's not buying it at all. He says it's merely stoking up rage. And as for Stu Peters, well, he's quite blunt about that. He says he's no time for the guy. Let me assure you, no time or further engagement with Stu Peters. He's irrelevant, a modern carnival barker. And Malone goes further. He's wondering that this is sort of well-financed. He says, where did that come from? Obviously, he's actually suspicious of this movie. So let's look into it. And let's look into the truth and the lies from mainstream and wherever in this issue. But first, what do they get horribly wrong in this movie? Well, the whole thing of died suddenly. That's what they got wrong. I mean, if you're going to have a movie about people dying suddenly, it should be fairly valid. There should be people in it who die suddenly. But it turns out that the trailer for the movie has 12 people fainting or getting seizures, implying they died from vaccines, when at least 4 of those people did not die, or there were no links to vaccines in their fainting episodes. I mean, this is horribly wrong. How do you get stuff that wrong? Some of them are absolutely blatant. For example, Kenyote Johnson, basketball player, collapsed in December 2020 before he could even have had a COVID vaccine. He didn't die suddenly, as the title suggests. In fact, he returned to court last week. Other people featured are also still alive, and several of the genuine deaths are explained by alternative. So let's just take a look in that article as well at some mainstream spin and see where that's misleading us also. The mainstream spin says that the reports of the embalmers and all that is just based mostly on the testimony of one embalmer, says this BBC critique, quoting a Dr. Han. And that's insufficient evidence, and blood clots are commonly found in dead bodies. Well, missing the point, it's not about one embalmer. Many people who are operating in the in mortuaries in different countries are reporting this. It's not down to one embalmer. We all know blood clots are commonly found, or uncommonly found indeed. But of course, we're not talking about whether they're found or not. We're talking about the quantity. And all these people are saying, we've got much higher quantities. So here we have truth and lies competing with each other. But some of the stuff is grotesquely badly wrong. For example, the BBC go on to point out that the graph of stillbirths shooting up around 2021 and the Australian stillbirths are particularly wrong. But in this case, Waterloo, Canada data from Ontario, province of Waterloo, hasn't seen any increase in stillbirths, according to a local reproductive immunologist. So that's another thing they got wrong. Let's move on to some of the other stuff they got wrong. Like, for example, this individual here. Here's the tweet. She didn't break her neck. It wasn't vaccine related. Hi, I'm all okay. Don't fall, people. Don't fall. Long dresses can, and then you fall down the stairs. Yeah, okay. She's not dead from a vaccine. No, unfortunately. And we saw the other case there. But I mean, some of them are egregious, such as this one here. A shot of a woman from Argentina passing out and falling into a moving train. This is ridiculous to be quoting this sort of stuff. She fainted due to low blood pressure. She survived and she didn't die suddenly and had nothing to do with a vaccine. That's a shot in the movie. What are they doing? Another shot shows a Royal Guard fainting, which is a common occurrence because they have to stand for long periods of time. What is this? How does this get past any normal movie review process where you're doing factual review, which is a standard process in any movie, especially when you're going to have a controversial one? You're going to review and make sure all your... This is so egregiously wrong, it's hard to believe you could get this stuff this badly wrong. Another shot shows Heather MacDonald fainting on stage, which she believed was from lack of eating and drinking that day. She completely survived and didn't die suddenly. So these are the problems, aren't they? You just cannot be getting stuff this badly wrong. And here's the stillbirth data from Ontario, where we see the stillbirth rate from March 2021 to February 2022 was 0.48%, and the stillbirth rate in the previous 5 years was 0.47%. Hardly an absolute indication of covert problems that are trying to be concealed. That's what the real data tells us. And when you go and check on the actual underlying data, you find it doesn't substantiate what has been said in the movie. But let's go on. Let me quote from Dr. Josh Geitzkopf, just to show you where he's coming from, right? Before we see what he says. He says there's some great information in this movie, information that could potentially open people's eyes and minds. In particular, the interviews with embalmers and morticians are incredible. The long, white fibrous material they've been finding in dead people's arteries and veins after the vaccine rollout is truly horrifying. It isn't new, because we have known this, but it's presented all in one place in a highly compelling way, especially the scene where you see it being removed from a dead body during an embalming session. The movie would have been far more effective if it had just focused on that. But unfortunately, it tainted that and other good information by covering it with a lot of garbage. Was that accidental? Let's look at the garbage he cites. For example, the DMED data, the military's medical database. Perhaps many of you do recall evidence being given to Senator Ron Johnson about data from that medical database. It seemed quite convincing. Would you be interested in an alternative explanation why that data seemed so interesting and high? Well, it turns out the whistleblowers made the mistake of counting every visit to the doctor's office instead of every diagnosis. You get diagnosed with something, you might visit the doctor 5, 6, 7 times in relation to the diagnosis. One diagnosis, 5 visits. So they were counting visits, not diagnosis. That's a simplified version of how they got it wrong. But that's the kind of stuff you go and check up, because there's a little hyperlink there. You can check up there and look where that alternative explanation. Unfortunately, none of the people involved in bringing that information forward, now that it's proved to be wrong, have been coming forward letting everybody know how they got that wrong. That's something they got wrong. So, declining birth rates in Australia was another one. And the absolutely stunning figure they showed for the huge drop in Australian birth rates. Anybody who does any research into this knows that the huge decline was due to a reporting problem, because they don't report the births during the Christmas period as well, and they catch up later. And so the numbers look wrong for a few months until they do the catch up and everything's okay. There are straightforward explanations there again. These are issues you've heard about, and maybe you've taken them on face value, some of the reports you've heard. But this is a lesson for all of us to question everything. But let's go on. One of the most egregious, and here we tie into something else, is the references to the very high miscarriage rate in Pfizer's report to the FDA. You've heard this being put forward as conclusive proof, haven't you? That there's something really dodgy going on, that there's this startling rate, over 80% of miscarriage. I've seen this error, says Dr. repeated many times by Naomi Wolf, most notably. And it turns out that these are based, right, on a similar voluntary reporting system to the VAERS system. This was not Pfizer tracking every individual right? And then finding out whether or not they'd had a successful pregnancy. No. This relied on adverse event reports coming back to a Pfizer voluntary reporting system. So what's the problem then, you're asking? Well, the problem is that if you have a successful birth, you're not going to contact them and let them know that you had a successful birth without any complications or difficulties in a totally successful normal pregnancy. If you have a stillbirth, you have a miscarriage, you're probably going to contact the adverse event reporting system then. So we can't rely on those. Obviously, there was huge numbers of people who had successful pregnancies wouldn't have contacted the adverse reporting system. It didn't take you long to understand that, did it? How come that Naomi Wolf is still pushing that? I've asked. Because, of course, Naomi worked for The Guardian, Huffington Post, and, was an American feminist author. Anybody who's worked for The Guardian, you have to be very careful about where they're coming from, because that's like Intelligence Agency Central in the United Kingdom. To be quite blunt, and I've said this before. So, she's a professional journalist. Surely she's able to establish that she's dealing with a voluntary reporting system there with the Pfizer data instead of going around hyping it up. We've got to ask questions, folks. But maybe it's ludicrous with a purpose. This is the Stu Peters' previous movie, Venom Theory. Is COVID-19 been spread via drinking water? Doctor theorizes a satanic elite is poisoning humanity's God-built DNA with serpentine genetics. Does it seem to you as if that story might be aimed at Christian elements in the United States? Maybe it is. And that is a connection which goes all the way to InfoWars, because this story has been run on InfoWars. So here we have Mike Adams and Stu Peters and InfoWars Alex Jones. You see how all three are connected here and promoting each other's stuff. And this thing by Mike Adams, which came out a few years before, a leaked video about a government plot to vaccinate against thoughts, ideas and religion. You heard about that? It was called FunVax, and I looked into it some time back. So the idea was there was some kind of a new vaccine which had been produced, right? And this vaccine was able to vaccinate you against being religious, so you wouldn't be a fundamentalist. This was the claim, right? A leaked Pentagon video, right? And it was Natural News which published this in 2015. Aerosolized to control, vaccine already tested, deployed via air, food and water. And they'd actually tested it out. And large-scale spraying, vehicle exhaust in food and in water. It could be put everywhere. There'd be nowhere really to hide. And it would just suddenly, you wouldn't believe in God anymore. Well, it turns out there's a much more prosaic explanation for it. I created the FunVax conspiracy theory. Now I'm trying to kill it. Ryan Harper, May 2021, put out the story that he created the FunVax story. It was a collaboration for a movie idea, a mockumentary, and part of it did indeed feature this presentation supposedly in front of the Department of Defense as part of this presentation. So what I find interesting about that is that, again, all of this FunVax stuff seems to me to be aimed at Christians again. So all of this, folks, has the appearances, all of this stuff has the appearances, and Stu Peters' involvement in it, of being an operation to discredit and a determined effort to penetrate into what you would call MAGA, Christian communities, etc., and implant disinformation into the hearts of those communities, using stories which will be attractive, which act as lures, which then enable further stuff to be wrapped up, packaged and sold as disinformation to our community, who rely on so-called truth tellers for what they're getting. And that's a real shame, because in this particular case it's being used to wipe out the testimony of many. And here's from McGill.ca, another attempt to just rubbish some of the stuff some of the actual personal testimonies in the movie. Hirschman and a few other embalmers testified to their findings, with some being blurred out, their voices altered like they're sharing secrets so damning they're about to be shipped to their local witness protection program. No, not really. They just don't want to speak out because they know they'll be picked on for trying to professionally reveal, as many medical professionals have been picked on. So you can't just dismiss as they're attempting to do like that. Again, this criticism says the problem is that embalmers and funeral directors are not medical professionals, and goes on to rant about how these are not medical professionals even. You don't have to be a medical professional to notice there's a big long rubbery thing coming out of somebody's body. And those were the key questions that needed to be asked. These questions needed to be asked, needed to be answered. And unfortunately, this valid set of questions has been layered over now by a pile of rubbish. And I don't think that that's a mistake. We need to question everything, and we need to be very careful. As I said in the last video, check it, the link to it in the description. Robert Malone thinks that Alex Jones is the real deal. And he's done an interview with Mike Adams. Now, I've just shown you that Mike Adams was running Stu Peters' snake venom rubbish, and Alex Jones was running that rubbish, and Alex Jones was also running the Funvax rubbish, which was pumped out by Mike Adams, who's tied to Stu Peters, who is an absolute hype monger and constantly used to demonize us. This is how we're being discredited, folks. How do you give somebody a candy? Well, you give them the candy wrapped in an attractive wrapper. And what they're doing is they're taking our candy and they're wrapping it in a dog turd wrapper. That's what they're doing to make it as unpalatable as possible. What I believe, to not beat around the bush any further, is that seeing this thing coming, right? Seeing these testimonies out and aware of the threat, which all these kinds of questions about post-vaccine morbidity and mortality raise, that somebody decided they better start wrapping up this material in discreditation wrappers in order to try and buy themselves some time and get people at least to emotionally reject the information because they've made it smell so disgusting despite the fact that it's valid. That's what I believe is going on. I believe that goes on all the time, and you can Google CIA fakes breakfornews.com to get the backstory on that, which I've been banging that drum on since 2005. So, folks, a brief opportunity to pull back the curtain and see what's really going on. And understand, as I said in yesterday's video, I've been around following these characters, these discrediting characters, since the mid-90s. Robert Malone hasn't. And many people are taken in by their seeming apparent champions for truth, which turn out to be a poisoned chalice. All right, that's it for this edition. I'll be back with more on other topics, and I look forward to your company for that as well. Thanks for joining me for this one. But until then, for breakfornews.com, this has been Fintan Dunn reporting. See you soon, folks.